A 6:42 hours, September 19th, 1944. A wall of German steel was moving through the fog. 45 Panther tanks, brand new from the factory, each one carrying armor so thick that no American weapon could punch through the front. Not one. Not at any range. Not even at point-blank distance. The crews inside those Panthers had been told one thing before they rolled out that morning. Nothing in the American arsenal could stop them. They were right about almost everything. Except for one man sitting in a vehicle so thin that a German machine gun could punch through its sides. A vehicle so lightly built that the entire floor was less than the thickness of your thumb. A vehicle that tank crews across the entire Third Army had given a nickname that said everything you needed to know about your odds of surviving inside it. The paper coffin. The paper. Sergeant Henry Hartman was 24 years old, a farm mechanic from rural Pennsylvania who had spent his entire life fixing tractors and diesel engines before the Army decided his hands were too useful to waste on a rifle. He had been in combat for exactly 47 days. He had destroyed 6 German vehicles. He had watched friends burn inside machines that were supposed to protect them. And on this particular Tuesday morning in eastern France, he was about to drive his paper-thin tank destroyer directly toward 45 of the most feared armored vehicles in World War II. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of a community that keeps these memories alive. By the time the fog lifted that morning, Hartman's crew would personally destroy 6 Panther tanks in 4 minutes of combat. Company C would kill 33 German tanks in a single engagement, and the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion would end the day with a kill ratio that military historians would spend decades trying to explain. But first, Hartman had to survive the next 60 seconds. Because somewhere in that fog, 45 Panthers were already moving toward his position. And the only thing standing between them and Patton's entire eastern flank was a 19-ton vehicle with 1 inch of armor and a driver who kept the engine running because stopping meant dying. To understand why what happened next was considered impossible, you need to understand what September 1944 looked like for the men fighting in eastern France. General George Patton's Third Army had crossed the Moselle River 2 weeks earlier. The liberation of Lunéville. The threat to Nancy. American armor was driving east, threatening to punch straight into Germany before winter arrived. For the Wehrmacht High Command, this was a catastrophe that demanded an immediate answer. The answer came in the form of 2 panzer brigades, fresh units, new equipment. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, 90 Panthers total, pulled directly from German factories and pointed west toward Patton's spearhead. Each Panther represented the absolute pinnacle of German tank engineering in 1944. 45 tons of sloped steel and mechanical precision. The long 75mm gun could kill an American Sherman at 3,000 meters. The frontal armor could stop any American tank round at any range. Most American tankers feared the Panther more than the famous Tiger. The 4th Armored Division was Patton's tip of the spear. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion was attached to the 4th Armored, and Company C of the 704th was positioned 3 miles east of Arracourt, France, directly in the path of what German planners believed would be an unstoppable armored fist. The numbers looked like a massacre waiting to happen. In 68 days since landing at Utah Beach, the 704th had knocked out 93 German vehicles. They had also lost 18 M18s destroyed and 22 damaged. 41 men killed, 73 wounded. Company C alone had lost 6 M18s in 3 weeks. 19 men killed, 8 wounded. The company had started with 12 tank destroyers. They were down to 10 operational vehicles. Battalion headquarters kept promising replacements. The replacements never came. Third Army intelligence had run the numbers. 40% of all tank destroyer crews became casualties within 90 days of landing in France. The 704th was already past that average. Every morning brought new names on the casualty list. Every afternoon brought orders to advance. The crews knew the math. They kept fighting anyway because there was nothing else to do. This was the situation Sergeant Henry Hartman woke up to on September 19th. Henry Hartman grew up in western Pennsylvania, the second son of a German-American farming family who had worked the same land for 3 generations. His father ran a mixed operation cattle corn and a side business repairing farm equipment for neighboring families. Hartman could rebuild a diesel engine by the time he was 15. Could diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone. The particular pitch of a misfiring cylinder, the subtle vibration of a worn bearing, the way a transmission felt different under load before it finally gave out. These were not skills he learned from books. They were skills he absorbed through 10,000 hours of greasy hands and broken equipment and the particular satisfaction of a machine running smoothly after you had coaxed it back to life. He was not a soldier by temperament. His Army induction records describe him as quiet, methodical, and precise. Not the kind of man who volunteered for anything dangerous. Not the kind of man who gave speeches or inspired crowds. The kind of man who showed up early, checked everything twice, and fixed problems before they became emergencies. The Army assigned him to tank destroyers because of his mechanical aptitude. The M18 Hellcat was a finicky, temperamental machine that demanded exactly the kind of patient technical attention Hartman had been practicing since childhood. He understood the Continental R975 radial engine the way other men understood their own heartbeat. He could feel through the hull when something was wrong before the gauges confirmed it. He had kept his M18 operational through conditions that had broken other vehicles entirely, and his crew trusted him completely. Not because he gave orders well, though he did. Not because he was fearless, though the records suggest he came close. They trusted him because in 47 days of combat, he had never once made a decision that cost them unnecessarily. Every shot called at the right moment. Every withdrawal executed before German guns found their range. 6 enemy vehicles destroyed and 5 men still alive. In Company C's brutal mathematics, that was extraordinary. The doctrine that governed how Hartman and his crew were supposed to fight had been developed over years of theoretical study and precious little actual combat experience. Army tank destroyer doctrine was built on a single premise. Speed defeats armor. You do not fight tanks by becoming a better tank. You fight tanks by becoming impossible to hit. You find your position. You engage from ambush. You fire, relocate, fire again. You never sit still long enough for the enemy to establish a firing solution. The M18 Hellcat existed to execute this doctrine perfectly. 55 miles per hour on open road. Twice the speed of a Sherman. 3 times faster than a Tiger. The designers had stripped away every pound of unnecessary weight to achieve that velocity. The armor was the first thing to go. 1 inch maximum. 25 millimeters at the thickest point. The floor was less than 5 millimeters of steel plate. The turret was open-topped, leaving the crew exposed to grenades, mortar fragments, and any infantryman with a rifle and a clear line of sight. German tankers called it the Blechbuchse, the tin can. Most American commanders ignored the doctrine entirely. They used M18s like tanks, static positions, direct frontal engagements, slugging matches at close range. That approach produced exactly the casualty rates the doctrine had warned about. But in the right hands, used the right way, the M18 was something entirely different. It was the fastest combat vehicle in the European theater. And in certain conditions, speed was a better form of armor than steel. On the morning of September 19th, fog was rolling across the fields east of Arracourt in thick, silent waves. Visibility had dropped to 30 feet. Perhaps less in places. Hartman understood immediately what that meant. At 30 feet of visibility, the Panther's superior optics were useless. The long-range accuracy of its gun was meaningless. The kill zone that extended to 3,000 meters in clear conditions collapsed down to the length of a house. And in that collapsed kill zone, something extraordinary became possible. An M18 could maneuver around a Panther's flank without being seen, could fire into the side armor at angles that the frontal plate made impossible, could relocate before the German crew knew where the shot had come from. The fog was not a tactical problem. The fog was armor. At 0658, Lieutenant Edwin Leeper's voice came through the radio. German armor spotted. Panthers moving toward Lezzy. Company C ordered forward. Hartmann's platoon would take point. 4M 20-meter spacing, advancing northeast into the thickest part of the morning fog. The Continental engine roared as Hartmann's driver pushed the Hellcat forward. The 9-cylinder radial produced the same power output as a Sherman's engine, but pushed half the weight. The acceleration was immediate and aggressive, the kind of forward momentum that reminded you this machine had been built for one purpose and one purpose only. The platoon moved at 15 miles per hour through visibility so poor that Hartmann could barely make out the vehicle ahead. The radio stayed quiet. Leeper had ordered minimal traffic. Sound discipline in the fog. They would see the Panthers before the Panthers saw them, or they would not see the Panthers at all, and would be dead in seconds. There was no middle ground. The first Panther appeared at 0719. A gun barrel materialized from the fog 30 feet ahead. Then a turret. Then the massive angular hull of a German tank moving slowly through the mist, the commander standing in the open cupola, scanning the fog for targets he could not find, because they were already all around him. Dedit, Leeper's gun cracked. The M62 armor-piercing round caught the Panther's side armor at a 90-degree angle. Perfect geometry. The shell penetrated. Smoke poured from the engine deck. The crew bailed out 3 men running into the fog and were gone. 5 seconds later, a second Panther emerged from the same direction. Hartmann's gunner fired without waiting for orders. The round hit low, tore through the running gear, destroyed the track. The Panther lurched sideways and stopped. The turret began to traverse, hunting for a target it could not see. The loader had another round in the breech before the German turret had moved 10 degrees. The second shot hit the turret ring. The traverse mechanism jammed. The crew abandoned the vehicle. 2 Panthers. 2 minutes. 0 American casualties. Then the wind shifted. Visibility increased from 30 feet to 50. And in those additional 20 feet of gray morning light, Hartmann saw what he was actually facing. Panthers, not just 2, not just a handful, dozens of them spread across the fields ahead, moving in column formation, completely unaware that 4 American tank destroyers had just killed their lead vehicles. The entire 113th Panzer Brigade was advancing toward Lezzy, 45 tanks, driving blind, into an ambush they did not know existed. Leeper's 4M18S opened fire from different positions simultaneously. The Germans could not locate the source of the incoming rounds. Panther after Panther absorbed hits into side armor, rear plates, engine decks. German tanks began burning one after another across the field. The 113th tried to return fire, but German rounds flew into empty fog. Not one German shell found an M18. Hartmann's crew worked with mechanical precision. The loader cycled rounds in 8 seconds. Armor-piercing, high-explosive armor-piercing. The gunner tracked targets through fog at ranges between 30 and 60 feet. Point blank. Every shot penetrated. The M18's thin armor was irrelevant because the Germans could not see them to shoot back. By 0724, Leeper's 4-vehicle platoon had destroyed 15 German tanks in 5 minutes of combat. The radio crackled with Captain Tom Evans's voice. Company C moving up. 8 additional M18S, 12 tank destroyers, total about to join the engagement. But Hartmann had just spotted 6 Panthers emerging directly from the fog on a collision course with his position. 6 German tanks against 1 M18. 30 feet of visibility. 17 rounds remaining. And Hartmann made a decision that every officer in Third Army would later call either the most reckless or the most tactically brilliant choice of the entire battle. He attacked. Not retreated. Not held position. Not waited for Company C to arrive. He drove his paper-thin tank destroyer directly towards 6 Panthers because in 30 feet of fog, speed and aggression were the only weapons that mattered. The Germans could not hit what they could not see. And as long as Hartmann kept moving, kept maneuvering, kept closing before the enemy could establish a firing solution, his 1 inch of armor was exactly as effective as 6 inches would have been. The Hellcat surged forward at 30 miles per hour. The lead Panther was 70 feet ahead, moving in column, unaware. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be studied in American armor schools for the rest of the war. The first shot came at 0726, range 60 feet, side armor just behind the turret. The round penetrated, and the Panther stopped burning before its crew had time to understand they had been hit. The other 5 Panthers kept moving. They had not heard the shot over their own engine noise. Hartmann's driver shifted position 20 feet right before the smoke from the first kill had cleared. The second Panther appeared. 8 seconds after the first shot, the gunner fired again. Running gear. Track destroyed. The German tank lurched sideways. The turret began to traverse, too slow. The loader was already ready. The next round hit the turret ring and froze the gun mid-arc. 2 down. 4 Panthers still advancing, still blind. In the next 90 seconds, Hartmann's M18 killed 4 more Panthers. Maneuvering constantly between shots. Never staying in one position long enough to be targeted. Firing into rear armor side plates fuel tanks. Using the fog the way the doctrine had always intended, as cover, as concealment, as the difference between survival and the kind of death that got you listed in battalion reports as killed in action due to enemy armor. 6 Panthers destroyed. 4 minutes. 23 rounds down to 17. 0 damage to the M18. When Company C arrived at 0732 and the fog began to lift, Captain Evans saw 21 burning Panthers spread across 300 meters of French farmland. Black smoke rising into the September sky. German crews scattered across the field, some surrendering, some running east toward their own lines. The 113th Panzer Brigade had driven straight into an ambush and lost nearly half its strength in 12 minutes, but the battle was far from over. Because at 11:30, reconnaissance returned with news that changed everything. The 111th Panzer Brigade, 45 fresh Panthers, was 6 miles east and closing. Expected contact by 1400 hours. And they were not making the same mistakes as the 113th. They were moving carefully, using scouts, maintaining proper spacing. The fog that had saved Company C all morning was lifting fast. By noon, visibility would reach 300 meters. At 300 meters, a Panther could penetrate an M18 anywhere, front, side, rear. The armor that had not mattered in 30 feet of fog would become a death sentence in clear conditions. 9 American tank destroyers, 45 German Panthers, full visibility, no fog. The math that had been impossible all morning was about to become real. Hartmann's crew checked their ammunition. 17 rounds. The gunner cleaned the barrel. The loader organized the shells. The driver checked the engine. Oil pressure normal. Fuel 3/4 full. The M18 was ready. Whether its crew would be alive in 3 hours was another question entirely. In Part 2, we will see how Company C fought the 111th Panzer Brigade across open ground in full daylight, the brutal mathematics of 9 against 45, and the moment at Arracourt when everything almost fell apart. Because the fog was gone. The Panthers could see them now. And survival required something even more dangerous than what Hartmann had already done. 9 M18s, 45 Panthers, no fog. That was the math Sergeant Henry Hartmann was staring at when the morning of September 19th turned from a miracle into a crisis. In Part 1, you watched 4 paper-thin American tank destroyers drive into 45 German Panthers and walk out having destroyed 33 of them. Fog speed training, and a 24-year-old farm mechanic from Pennsylvania who understood that sometimes attacking is the only way to survive. Company C of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had just achieved a kill ratio that no American armor unit in Europe had ever recorded. But the fog was gone now, and at 11:30 hours, reconnaissance reported the 111th Panzer Brigade moving west. 45 fresh Panthers. Experienced crews. and they had spent the last 3 hours studying exactly what had just happened to the 113th. They were not making the same mistakes. The number that should stop you cold is this. At 300 meters in clear visibility, a Panther 75mm gun could penetrate an M18 anywhere. Front, side, rear, it did not matter. One hit anywhere on the vehicle meant 5 men dead, and the 111th Panzer Brigade was going to have 300 meters of clear visibility in approximately 90 minutes. Captain Tom Evans stood at his command post looking at 9 operational M18s and a map showing 45 Panthers 6 miles east. Battalion headquarters had promised reinforcements. 2 platoons from Company A, 8 more Hellcats. Estimated arrival time 1,600 hours. The Germans would arrive at 1400. Evans called his commanders together. Hartmann Sergeant Dale Boggs, Sergeant Frank Cushman. 3 men who had been fighting since dawn and had already used half their ammunition. Evans spread the map across the hood of his M18 and did not soften what he was about to say. We delay them. We do not stop them. We cannot stop them, not 9 against 45 in open ground. We find positions, we hit them hard, we relocate before they can return effective fire, and we keep doing that until Company A arrives or we run out of tanks. Hartmann looked at the map. The terrain west of Arracourt offered 3 ridgelines before the town itself. 3 natural defensive positions, 3 opportunities to inflict damage and withdraw before the Panthers could concentrate their fire. How many do we need to kill to make them slow down? Hartmann asked. Evans did not hesitate. Enough that their commanders start thinking about what happened to the 113th. That was not a number. But everyone in that circle understood what it meant. The 111th Panzer Brigade attacked at 13:20 hours. 45 Panthers advancing in 3 battle groups, 15 tanks per group, 200 meters, spacing between groups. The German commanders had studied the morning's disaster and drawn exactly the right conclusions. No more column formations. No more blind advances. Scouts forward. Flanking security. Methodical advance with overlapping fire support between groups. These were professionals, properly trained, using correct doctrine. Company C was waiting on the first ridgeline, 9 M18s in hull-down positions, only the turrets visible above the crest. Evans had spread his tank destroyers across 800 meters. Wide frontage. Overlapping fields of fire. Each crew had a designated kill zone and a withdrawal route memorized. The Panthers crossed the 400-meter line. Evans held fire. 350 meters. Still held. 300 meters. Evans gave the order. 9 guns fired simultaneously. The first volley hit 6 Panthers. 3 kills. 3 mobility kills. Tracks destroyed, vehicles stopped, but guns still operational. The German advance halted. For approximately 4 seconds, the battlefield was silent. Then 42 Panther guns opened fire. The sound was different from the morning. In fog, the Germans had fired blindly, rounds disappearing into mist. Now they could see. The incoming fire was aimed, targeted, terrifyingly accurate. High-velocity armor-piercing rounds screamed across 300 meters and arrived before the sound of the guns that fired them. One M18 took a direct hit to the turret. The entire turret assembly left the vehicle. All 5 crew members died before they understood they had been found. Another Hellcat took a round through the forward hull. The driver and assistant driver were killed instantly. The remaining 3 crew members bailed out under fire and ran. 7 M18s remained. 7 M18Cs. Evans ordered immediate withdrawal. The Hellcats reversed down the slope in 90 seconds. The entire company disappeared behind the ridge before the German advance could resume. The Panthers crested the ridgeline 3 minutes later to find empty positions and tire tracks leading west. Hartmann's crew had fired 4 rounds from the first position. 2 confirmed kills. 14 rounds remaining. The gunner's hands were no longer shaking. Past a certain point of exhaustion, the body stops trembling and simply operates. The loader's shoulder had been aching since 0800, and he had stopped noticing it entirely. The second engagement happened at 13:45 on the next ridgeline. 7 M18 new positions, fresh angles on an enemy that was now advancing more cautiously. Company C opened fire at 300 meters again. The second volley destroyed 5 Panthers, 2 more mobility kills. German return fire was faster this time, more coordinated. 2 more M18s were hit, 1 destroyed, 1 damaged badly enough that the crew abandoned it and split between the remaining vehicles. 5 M18s. 35 Panthers still operational. Evans pulled back again. Same tactic. Reverse relocate, find cover. The withdrawal route led toward Arracourt itself. Urban terrain. Buildings, narrow streets, stone walls, the kind of close-quarters environment that neutralized the Panther's range advantage and made the M18's speed a weapon again. We take them into town, Evans told his commanders during the 30-second briefing at the base of the second ridge. Street fighting. They have to come to us. We pick the angles. Hartman understood immediately. In a town, every corner was an ambush. Every intersection was a kill zone. A Panther in a narrow street had nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to bring its frontal armor to bear against a threat appearing from a perpendicular alley. The geometry that made the Panther nearly invincible in open ground became a liability in urban terrain. The 111th Panzer Brigade reached Arracourt's outskirts at 1442. 35 Panthers. 5 American tank destroyers waiting inside. The odds were 7-1, and Evans positioned his Hellcats at key intersections with interlocking fields of fire and escape routes through back alleys that his drivers had reconnoitered during the 30-minute withdrawal. Hartman's M18 was positioned perpendicular to the main approach road. Perfect 90-degree angle to anything advancing down Rue Denis. He could see 60 feet of the main street from his alley. Anything entering that 60-foot window was going to receive an armor-piercing round into its side plate before the crew inside knew the threat existed. The first 8 Panthers entered Arracourt at 1442, moving in a column down Rue Denis. Hartman's gunner watched the first Panther roll past, then the second, then the third. He let 3 Panthers pass and then fired at the fourth, side shot, 200 feet. The round penetrated, and the Panther exploded with enough force to lift the turret 6 inches off the hull before dropping it sideways into the street. The burning wreck blocked the road completely. The 3 Panthers behind it were trapped. Company C worked through the German column like a mechanism, each M18 at its designated intersection, waiting for the angle, taking the shot, relocating through the alley network before the German crews could respond. The Panthers tried to return fire down narrow streets at targets that disappeared before the guns could traverse. They tried to reverse, but the burning wreck at the rear of the column blocked withdrawal. They tried to advance, but the M18s were already gone from the positions they had fired from. Tahiti. In 22 minutes of street fighting, Company C destroyed 6 Panthers and lost 1 M18 to a German round that found the alley where Sergeant Boggs had parked after his second shot. Boggs and 2 of his crew survived. 2 did not. 4 Hellcats remained operational. 29 German Panthers withdrew from Arracourt at 15:04 hours. The 111th Panzer Brigade had entered the battle with 45 tanks. It left with 29, 16 destroyed, no breakthrough achieved. Patton's eastern flank remained intact. When Evans transmitted the combat report to battalion headquarters at 15:30, the numbers covered both engagements. 49 Panthers destroyed in a single day, 6 M18s lost, 7 men killed, 11 wounded. A kill ratio that the battalion operations officer initially refused to forward to 3rd Army Command without personal verification, because the numbers seemed incompatible with physical reality. Company A's reinforcements arrived at 16:12 hours, 12 minutes after the German withdrawal. 8 more M18 rolling into a town that smelled of cordite and burning fuel, their crews expecting to find a battle, and instead finding 4 exhausted Hellcats and their commanders sitting on the steps of a stone building drinking water from canteens and not talking about anything at all. Hartman had fired 28 rounds since 0658. 9 Panthers confirmed destroyed across the full day of fighting. His M18 had been hit twice by fragments and once by a round that grazed the rear hull and left a scar in the steel but did not penetrate. 5 men, all alive. But here is what the battalion report filed that evening did not capture the number that intelligence officers and armor analysts would fixate on for the following weeks. The 113th Panzer Brigade had arrived that morning with 45 brand new Panthers and crews that had been told those tanks were invincible. The 111th had arrived with the same equipment and the same confidence. Together, 90 Panthers. Together, they had been stopped by an American unit that should have been destroyed in the first exchange of fire by any reasonable calculation of armor thickness and gun penetration values. German 5th Panzer Army pulled both brigades east by nightfall. The counterattack that was supposed to push Patton's Third Army back across the Moselle River had failed completely. The threat to Nancy was over. The drive toward Germany could continue. General Patton arrived at Company C's command post the following morning. He walked among the M18s, examined the thin armor, read the combat reports standing in the street. He stopped in front of Hartmann's vehicle and looked at the scar on the rear hull where the German round had grazed the steel. "How does a 1-inch tank kill 6 Panthers at point-blank range?" Patton asked. Hartmann thought about the fog and the speed and 18 months of training, and 5 men who had learned to work together like parts of a single machine. He thought about the doctrine that most commanders ignored and the specific conditions of September 19th that had made following that doctrine possible. "Fog, sir," Hartmann said. "Speed, training, and luck." Patton looked at him for a long moment. "The luck, I believe," Patton said. "The rest you earned. In Part 3, we will see what happened when German High Command received the full report of what Company C had done at Arracourt." Because the Wehrmacht's response to losing 90 Panthers in one day was not to retreat. It was to study, to adapt, and to send something specifically designed to kill M18s before they could maneuver. Something that removed the speed advantage entirely. Something that turned the doctrine that had saved Company C into a liability. The paper coffin was about to face the reason it had been named that in the first place. 49 Panthers destroyed in a single day. 9 M18s. 5 men per crew. 1 inch of armor. That was the report that left Arracourt on the evening of September 19th and landed on the desk of German 5th Panzer Army headquarters before midnight. The officer who read it first set it down, picked it up again, and read it a second time before forwarding it up the chain with a handwritten note attached. The note said 3 words, "Verify," before distributing. They verified it. Every number was accurate. Danke. And somewhere in the German command structure a very uncomfortable question began circulating. If American tank destroyers with 1 inch of armor could kill 49 Panthers in daylight and fog combined, what happened when those same tank destroyers faced the rest of the Wehrmacht's armored strength in the weeks ahead? The answer was about to be written across eastern France, and it would not go the way the Germans planned. German 5th Panzer Army's after-action analysis of Arracourt reached Berlin within 72 hours. The conclusions were not comfortable reading. The 113th Panzer Brigade had lost 33 tanks in 12 minutes to inferior vehicles by failing to use reconnaissance, maintaining column formations in zero visibility, and advancing without flank security into terrain that favored ambush tactics. The 111th had lost 16 additional Panthers to the same unit in afternoon fighting by underestimating the defensive potential of urban terrain. 90 Panthers destroyed or captured in the Arracourt engagement area. Total German armored losses in the broader September counteroffensive exceeded 200 vehicles. The 2 Panzer brigades that were supposed to push Patton back across the Moselle had been combat ineffective within 48 hours of their first engagement. Wehrmacht armor commanders drew specific conclusions. The M18 Hellcat was not survivable in direct confrontation. They understood this. What they had failed to account for was that American tank destroyer crews were not fighting direct confrontations. They were fighting the doctrine that the M18 had been designed to execute. Ambush. Relocate. Ambush again. The vehicle's thin armor was never supposed to be its protection. Its protection was the fact that it was never where you aimed. The German response was logical and immediate. If American tank destroyers survived by moving, the answer was to stop them from moving. Infantry anti-tank teams equipped with Panzerfaust rocket launchers could eliminate M18s at close range before the Hellcats could maneuver away. Coordinated attacks using infantry and armor together with infantry advancing to flush tank destroyers from ambush positions, while armor provided overwatch, would neutralize the tactics that had destroyed the Panzer brigades at Arracourt. The Wehrmacht began retraining its combined arms doctrine specifically around this threat. More Panzerfaust distribution to infantry units, new protocols for advance reconnaissance, standing orders that no armored column was to advance without infantry screen ahead. It was a sound tactical response. It would have worked against a unit that fought the same way twice. But here is the problem the Germans had not fully accounted for. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had also been studying what happened at Arracourt. And the lessons they extracted were different from the ones their enemy had learned. The battalion's intelligence officer, Captain Gerald Stutzman, compiled a detailed analysis of every engagement from September 19th through September 22nd. He cross-referenced crew reports, ammunition expenditure records, vehicle damage assessments, and prisoner interrogation summaries. The analysis identified something specific. The engagements that produced the highest kill ratios shared three characteristics: fog or limited visibility that suppressed German long-range accuracy, terrain that channeled German advances into predictable routes, and American crews that relocated after every shot, never occupying the same position twice. And the engagements that produced American casualties shared different characteristics: extended stays in fixed positions, predictable firing angles that German crews could calculate after the second or third shot, and situations where American vehicles had been forced to engage frontally rather than from the flank. Stutzman brought the analysis to Evans, now promoted to major. Evans read it twice. Then he scheduled battalion-wide tactical training for every crew that was not in contact. Not classroom instruction. Practical exercises. Crew relocation drills. Timed repositioning under simulated fire. Gunners practicing target acquisition from unfamiliar angles. Drivers rehearsing emergency maneuvers through urban terrain. The 704th was getting better at exactly the moment the Germans were trying to figure out how to stop them. The test came on October 4, 1944, 15 miles northeast of Arracourt, near the town of Frasnes-en-Saulnois. German forces had established a defensive line anchored on three villages. The position blocked 4th Armored Division's advance along the primary route east. Intelligence reported a mixed force defending the line: 12 Panthers, 8 Panzer IVs, and a full infantry regiment with heavy anti-tank support. The German commanders had specifically cited their positions to deny American armor the flanking angles that had been so effective at Arracourt. Open fields of fire, interlocking coverage, no dead ground for maneuvering. It was a position designed by officers who had read the Arracourt report and built their defense around preventing it from happening again. Company C and Company B of the 704th were attached to the assault. 16 M18 total. The German position had 20 armored vehicles and several thousand infantry. Evans had 2 hours to study the terrain before the attack order came down. He found the answer in a drainage canal. The canal ran northeast to southwest along the eastern edge of the German position. It was not wide enough for tanks. It was not deep enough to matter tactically, but it was lined with mature trees that had grown tall enough to create an overhead canopy that broke up the silhouettes of anything moving along its bank. Aerial reconnaissance showed the canal running within 400 meters of the German right flank, the position least supported by interlocking fire from the other strong points. Evans split his force. 8 M18s would engage the German center frontally, making enough noise and movement to hold German attention and prevent redeployment. Eight M18s, including Hartmann's crew, would move along the canal, use the tree canopy as concealment, reach the German right flank, and hit it from an angle the defensive plan had not accounted for. The assault began at 06:15 on October 4th. The frontal demonstration by Company B opened fire at maximum range. German guns responded immediately. The Panthers in the center began engaging the visible American vehicles. Exactly what Evans needed. Hartmann's group moved along the canal at walking pace. Engines throttled back. Minimum noise. The tree canopy overhead made them invisible from above. The canal bank masked their silhouette from the flanks. 400 meters, 300, 200. The German right flank came into view. 3 Panthers, 2 Panzer IVs. Infantry positions behind stone walls. All of them facing west, watching the frontal engagement with no idea that 8 American tank destroyers were approaching from their exposed right side at less than 150 meters. Hartmann's gunner acquired the nearest Panther. Side armor. 90 degrees. 120 meters. He fired. The Panther stopped. Burning. 7 other M18s fired within the next 4 seconds. The German right flank ceased to exist as a coherent defensive position in the time it takes to draw a slow breath. 3 Panthers destroyed. 2 Panzer IVs destroyed. Infantry positions collapsed under high explosive rounds that arrived before the defenders could process what was happening or where the fire was coming from. The German center, already engaged frontally by Company B, now began receiving fire from their right. Then, their right rear as Hartmann's group repositioned along the canal. The defensive plan that had been built specifically to prevent Arracourt-style flanking attacks was being taken apart from an angle the planners had dismissed as inaccessible. German armor began withdrawing from the center to address the flank threat. Company B pursued immediately closing range as the Panthers turned away to deal with Hartmann's group. Panthers turning to face one threat exposed their flanks to the other. The German position collapsed in 38 minutes. 11 Panthers destroyed. 7 Panzer IVs destroyed. Infantry regiment withdrew northeast, abandoning heavy equipment. 4th Armored Division's route east was open. The 3 villages that had anchored the German line were taken by following infantry units before noon. Company C lost 1 M18 to a Panzerfaust round that hit during the withdrawal phase. The crew evacuated. No fatalities. Hartmann's crew had fired 19 rounds. 4 confirmed kills. The German officer who had designed the defensive position at Frasnes-en-Saulnois was taken prisoner 3 days later during the broader collapse of the German line. American intelligence officers interviewed him specifically about his defensive plan. He confirmed that it had been built to prevent Arracourt-style tactics. He was asked how the Americans had defeated it anyway. He considered the question for a moment. Then he said something that the intelligence officer transcribed verbatim in the report. "Your tank destroyers did not attack the position I built. They attacked the position I forgot to build." The news from Frasnes-en-Saulnois moved through 4th Armored Division quickly, then through 3rd Army, then into Eisenhower's headquarters. The pattern that had emerged at Arracourt was not a one-time anomaly produced by unusual fog conditions. It was a repeatable result produced by trained crews executing correct doctrine with a vehicle designed specifically to exploit terrain and movement. 3rd Army Intelligence compiled the cumulative numbers from the 704th's operations between September 19th and October 10th. 281 German armored vehicles destroyed or captured. 7 M18s destroyed. 14 damaged and repaired. 23 men killed. 41 wounded. The kill ratio was 40-1. No American armor unit in the European theater had produced comparable numbers against German armored forces. Not Sherman battalions. Not tank destroyer units equipped with towed guns. Not any formation using any vehicle. The 704th's results stood alone in the statistical record of Western Front combat. The implications rippled upward through the command structure with unusual speed. Eisenhower's headquarters requested the full tactical analysis from Stutzman's intelligence report. The War Department in Washington received a summary copy. Army Ground Forces. The organization responsible for doctrine development opened a formal review of tank destroyer employment based specifically on the 704th's performance. German 5th Panzer Army's September counteroffensive had failed completely. The two panzer brigades that were supposed to push Patton back across the Moselle had been destroyed before they could achieve any of their operational objectives. The threat to Nancy was gone. The threat to 4th Armored's eastern flank was gone. Patton's drive toward Germany continued without the delay that German planners had counted on to allow defensive reorganization along the Rhine. Military historians would later estimate that the defeat of the September counteroffensive at Arracourt and in the subsequent October fighting accelerated the Allied advance into Germany by a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks. 3 to 4 weeks of war. The human cost of 3 to 4 weeks of combat on the Western Front in the autumn of 1944 ran into the tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. Henry Hartmann was promoted to staff sergeant on October 12th. The citation described his actions at Arracourt and credited him with 9 confirmed armored vehicle kills across the full period of September 19th through October 10th. Captain Evans. Now Major Evans submitted Hartmann's name for the Silver Star. The paperwork went through battalion, regiment, division, and Army headquarters in 11 days, a speed that indicated something unusual about the level of attention the 704th's performance had attracted. The Silver Star was awarded at a brief ceremony that Hartmann described in a letter home as embarrassing because all 5 crew members deserved the same medal and only one name fit on the citation. But here is the part of this story that most accounts leave out entirely, the part that only becomes visible when you read the letters Hartmann wrote home between October and December of 1944. The letters where he described what it actually felt like to be inside a paper-thin vehicle facing some of the most powerful weapons the German military had ever built, and to come out alive and then to climb back in the next morning and do it again. What happened to Sergeant Henry Hartmann after the cameras stopped pointing at Arracourt, after the historians moved on to the Battle of the Bulge, after the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion was deactivated and its men went home to their farms and machine shops and ordinary lives? That story is in part 4, and it is the part that changes how you understand everything that came before it. From a farm mechanic in Pennsylvania who fixed tractors before the Army found him to a staff sergeant who destroyed 9 German armored vehicles in 3 weeks of combat in eastern France. From a vehicle everyone called the paper coffin to the most effective tank destroyer in the European theater. From a doctrine that most American commanders ignored to the tactical playbook that stopped an entire German Panzer Army in its tracks. That is the journey you have followed across 3 parts of this story. And part 3 ended with a question that the Silver Star citation and the battalion records and the military history books do not fully answer. What happened to Henry Hartmann after the cameras stopped pointing at Arracourt? What happened to the 5 men who climbed into a 1-inch tank every morning, knowing the mathematics of their survival, and climbed out alive anyway? This story has one final chapter, and it contains something that almost no account of Arracourt has ever mentioned. Because sometimes the most important part of a story is not the battle, it is what the man carries home from it. Henry Hartmann crossed the Rhine with the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion in March 1945. The battalion reached Czechoslovakia in early May. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Hartmann was 25 years old. He had been in combat for 241 days. His M18 had been hit 3 times by fragments and once by a grazing round that left a scar in the rear hull without penetrating. His crew of 5 had remained intact from Arracourt to the end of the war, which in the statistical context of American tank destroyer casualties in Europe was an outcome so improbable that the battalion's own records treated almost as an anomaly. He was demobilized in November 1945 at Fort Dix, New Jersey. He received his discharge papers, his back pay, his medals in a small envelope, and a bus ticket to Pittsburgh. He went home to Western Pennsylvania. He went back to fixing farm equipment. His neighbors knew he had been in the army. Most of them did not ask many questions. The ones who asked received short answers. He had been in France. He had been in Germany. He was glad to be home. The conversations ended there, not because Hartman was damaged in the visible ways that post-war fiction tends to portray veterans, but because he genuinely did not know how to explain what Arracourt had been to people who had spent those same months worrying about crop yields and fuel rationing. How do you describe driving a vehicle with 1 inch of armor toward 45 German tanks? How do you explain what it felt like when the fog was the only thing keeping you alive, and you knew it, and you drove forward anyway? Well, he did not try. He fixed engines. He married a woman named Dorothy in 1947. He had 3 children. He attended the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion reunions when they were held, which was not often. He shook hands with men who had shared the same fog on the same September morning, and they talked about the things that veterans talk about when they are not talking about what they are actually remembering. He never claimed hero status. When people asked about Arracourt, he mentioned his crew first, always. The gunner who could hit targets in 0 visibility. The loader who cycled rounds in 8 seconds with blistered hands. The driver who kept the engine running because stopping meant dying. 5 men working together. That was his explanation for everything. He died in 1987 at the age of 67. The obituary in the local Pennsylvania newspaper described him as a veteran, a farmer, and a mechanic. It mentioned his military service in 1 sentence. It did not mention Arracourt. It did not mention the 9 Panthers. It did not mention the Silver Star. The men who fought beside him would have found that entirely appropriate and entirely wrong. But Hartman's personal obscurity did not diminish what he and the 704th had built. Because the legacy of Arracourt did not stay in eastern France in September 1944. It traveled forward through time in ways that Hartman never fully understood, and military historians are still tracing today. And the M18 Hellcat remained in American service until 1953. It served in the Korean War, where its speed advantage proved valuable in the mobile fighting of 1950 and 1951. American crews in Korea used the same tactical principles that had worked at Arracourt ambush positions, rapid relocation flank engagement, rather than frontal confrontation. The results were not as dramatic as Arracourt because the terrain and enemy armor were different, but the doctrine that the 704th had validated in France provided the foundational framework for how American anti-armor units fought throughout the Korean peninsula. The broader influence extended further. The tactical analysis from Arracourt, specifically Stutzman's intelligence report compiled in October 1944, became required reading at the Army's Armor School at Fort Knox. It remained in the curriculum for more than 2 decades. Officers who had never heard of Henry Hartman by name learned the principles he had demonstrated. Fire from ambush. Relocate immediately. Use terrain as cover. Never occupy the same position twice. Engage from the flank. Speed is armor when armor is unavailable. These principles did not disappear when the M18 was retired. They migrated into the doctrine governing how American anti-armor units would fight with newer vehicles and newer weapons. The TOW missile systems deployed in Vietnam. The Bradley fighting vehicle's anti-armor role in the Gulf War. The fundamental logic of light-fast mobile anti-armor platforms remained the same. The vehicle changed. The physics did not. 14 nations operated the M18 Hellcat at various points between 1944 and the 1990s. Yugoslavia used modified M18s until 2003. The basic design, a lightweight chassis optimized for speed, carrying a high-velocity gun, influenced the development of wheeled tank destroyers that multiple European militaries deployed through the Cold War and beyond. The idea that Hartman's crew had proven on a foggy morning in France that speed and training and correct doctrine could overcome armor and firepower became embedded in military thinking across the Western world. The total number of German armored vehicles destroyed by M18 Hellcats across the entire European campaign from 1944 to 1945 exceeded 2,000. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion's contribution to that number 281 confirmed kills represented one of the highest concentration of armored vehicle kills achieved by any single American battalion in the Western Theater. The battalion lost 47 men killed in action across the full campaign, a devastating number in absolute terms. Against the scale of what they achieved, a ratio that no comparable unit matched. But the largest number is the one that cannot be precisely calculated, and that is the number of lives that did not end because the September counteroffensive at Arracourt failed. German 5th Panzer Army's plan had been to push Patton back across the Moselle, disrupt the Allied advance, and buy time for the Wehrmacht to reorganize its defensive line along the Rhine. If that counteroffensive had succeeded, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 would have begun against an Allied position significantly weaker than the one that actually existed. The margin between German failure and German success in the Bulge was narrow enough that historians continue to debate it. The margin at Arracourt was not narrow. It was 49 Panthers in one day and a failed counteroffensive that never recovered its momentum. How many lives does that calculation contain? Nobody can say precisely. The estimates run into the tens of thousands on both sides. That is the weight of what 5 men in a 1-inch tank accomplished on a foggy Tuesday in France. Now, here is the detail that most accounts of Arracourt omit entirely. The detail that changes the texture of everything that came before it. In 1984, the United States Army Center of Military History declassified a portion of the after-action records from the German 5th Panzer Army, covering the September 1944 counteroffensive. Among those records was the personal journal of General Major Burkhard Müller-Hillebrand, the officer responsible for coordinating the 2 Panzer Brigade attacks. The journal entries covering September 19th through September 22nd had been considered sensitive enough to withhold for 40 years. The entry for September 20th, 1944, the day after Arracourt, contains a passage that military historians have quoted in academic journals, but that has never appeared in a popular account of the battle. Müller-Hillebrand wrote that after receiving the full casualty report from the 113th and 111th Panzer Brigades, he spent the evening attempting to identify what tactical mistake had caused the disaster. He consulted with his staff. He reviewed the reconnaissance reports. He examined the weather records showing the fog conditions. And he arrived at a conclusion that he recorded in his journal with evident reluctance. The conclusion was that no tactical mistake had caused the disaster. The German tank commanders had used reasonable doctrine for the conditions they expected to encounter. The problem was that the Americans had used better doctrine for the conditions that actually existed, and the Americans had been better trained to execute that doctrine under pressure. The German general, a professional soldier with 30 years of experience, wrote in his private journal the night after losing 90 Panthers that the defeat at Arracourt was not a failure of German equipment or German courage. It was a failure to recognize that an enemy with inferior machines could defeat superior machines through superior thinking. He wrote those words in 1944. They were classified and stored in an archive. They were declassified in 1984. And they constitute, from the mouth of the enemy commander himself, the most precise explanation of what Henry Hartmann and the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had actually accomplished. Not just a tactical victory, a proof of concept, a demonstration conducted under the most unforgiving conditions imaginable that the quality of thinking behind a weapon matters more than the specifications of the weapon itself. From a farm mechanic from Pennsylvania, with grease under his fingernails, and 18 months of training, to a battle that stopped a German panzer army and helped shorten the deadliest war in human history. From a vehicle that everyone called the paper coffin, to the machine that the enemy general recorded in his private journal as the instrument of his defeat. From a doctrine that most American commanders ignored, to the foundational principles of anti-armor warfare that military schools would teach for the next 5 decades. Henry Hartmann drove a 1-inch tank against 45 Panthers because the doctrine was right and the training was right and the fog was there, And sometimes the only choice available is the dangerous one. He went home, fixed engines, raised 3 children, and died with his obituary mentioning his military service in one sentence. The German general who lost 90 tanks to his battalion understood what Hartmann had done better than most of the people who awarded him medals. Superior thinking defeats superior machines. That was true in the fog east of Arracourt on September 19, 1944. It has been true in every conflict before and since. And it will be true in every conflict that has not happened yet, in every room where someone with an unconventional idea is being told that the idea is crazy, impossible, suicidal, not worth the risk. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and whether someone in your family served. This channel exists to find the stories that history buried under more famous names and louder battles. There are hundreds of them. Stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things in circumstances that gave them no good options, only less bad ones. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next story is already waiting. Because the most important battles are almost never the ones you already know about. They are the ones fought by people whose obituaries got the details wrong.